And hello, welcome to the Mystic Chat. Today we are going to talk about the winter shadows and the Krampus and things like that. Things that go bump in the night that aren't necessarily Santa Claus and the elves. Well, it could be the elves. The elves can be kind of scary too. I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Chris Allen. I am a minister with the Fellowship of the Phoenix and a published author. I would like to take this time to introduce my fellow host, Ruby Rose. Ruby, take it away and introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I'm Ruby Ruse. I am a pagan YouTube artist. My channel focuses on fairy folklore, fairy magic, and fairy themed events. You can find me at Fairy Fortunes on YouTube, so I do hope you will check out my channel. And with that, I would very much like to introduce our fellow host, Luke Babb.
Hi, everybody. My name is Luke. I am a devotional polytheist who works with the Norse and Hellenic pantheons mostly, sort of a magical jack of all trades. I am sure you'll hear more about me at some point, but I'll pass the horn to Laura Gonzalez.
Hello, everybody. Hi, my name is Laura Gonzalez. I am a podcaster with CSMP, the Circle Sanctuary Nebula podcast. I'm a minister with Circle Sanctuary. I'm a priestess of the goddess. I'm a witch for hire. And I do a lot of things that I'm not going to be talking about here all night. But I do podcasts. And through podcasts and through communication, I have met this wonderful artist and intriguing, beautiful being who introduced me to the other wonderful being, the Krampus. But I will let her describe herself and introduce herself, the one and only, the knife, Rosemary Stehlik.
Thank you, Laura. I hope everyone can hear me now. Welcome to my shadowy world. My whole focus as an artist, multidimensional artist, or as I like to call myself, a visionary alchemist, is to dive into the furthest regions of the dark side of the human psyche and to deal with shadow work in the Jungian sense, the abyss, things that are mysterious and hard to explain that occupy the regions of fear in the human collective unconscious. And that comes through in my art, in multi-dimensional media type things I do, dance, performance. I'm also a martial arts teacher. I practice Shaolin Kung Fu. And the whole dance of Zen translates there. And after a 3-year hiatus, I am slowly rising like a phoenix with my fine arts website, which later I will tell you more about, but it's basically my name, www.rosemarystehlik.com. And there's so much more I can share with you, but one of the things to also keep in mind for my artistic voice is that I am a very proud member of the illustrious 21st Century Surrealist Guild, known as the International Association of Art of Imagination. So you can find all of that tying into one big bow that somehow will lead us to the Krampus.
That's awesome. So we're at the time we're past Samhain and we're going into Yule, and a lot of people think this time, oh, light and Christmas and things like that. But as we know, originally in the northern European countries, not so much with the happy. So tell us about the Shadow Time and the Krampus and things like that.
Well, it's very interesting. I can just start with a very tiny peek into the labyrinth of my childhood, where I spent some years of my life living in Düsseldorf, Germany, as well as Nagykovácsi, which is in the Pest side of Budapest in Hungary. These are small villages with dusty roads and farms, and I spent most of my childhood educated by nature as my high priestess. I was very solitary. It took me a long time to be in the third dimension. Like my mother said, I disappeared all the time. I walked in my sleep until I was 21. So like the lunar subconscious tides are way more natural for me. And it took an entire lifetime to be present in this dimension. So a lot of the things that spoke to me were things that reflect the liminal spaces of life. Dreams, the unknown, the mysterious, the unexplained. I loved watching ghost stories or, mysteries of the unknown, and uh, vampires, witches, all these things always fascinated me. And because my childhood dealt with so much moving, because we're Magyar Romani, Hungarian gypsies on my mother's side, the only things that remained constant were things that were nature. So the night, the phases of the moon, no matter where I lived, these were constants, the stars. And this is where I placed my faith. So pre-Christian, pagan, old European, animistic ceremonial ritual became very much a part of my life. Very much. I remember my mother shining her boot, because in Hungary, that's what you do. You shine your boot and you put it in the windowsill for Mikolas to see, who's Saint Nicholas. And he passes by and judges the state of the shine, like the military. And of course, this also takes into account how you were conducting yourself throughout the year. And if you were bad, Ördög, or the devil, was behind him with his switch, ready to take the child and put the child in the sack, whip them a few times with the birch branches, tear them to pieces, put them in the basket, and leave a lump of coal behind. So, these were natural parts of my childhood fairy tale life, and then growing up with a father who had a very active imagination in sci-fi and horror. So these were natural for me. Like I kind of felt like we were the Addams family. Cutting off the roses' heads and stuff. These were not things that were weird, we just did all sorts of things that later, once I got integrated into the school system and I would speak of these things, I realized the power of silence, like to keep silence as one of the witches' creeds. I understood its meaning, because there would be times I would just speak like something is just natural, and then suddenly 5 people want to beat me up after school. So it became very clear that there's another sort of undercurrent of the collective unconscious of humanity that is more sensitive and not to be discussed. And Krampus became a part of that. Don't mention Krampus. Just be good all year. Just be good. And his celebration was definitely a regular part of our household.
So what was that celebration like? Like, what did it look like? What did you do? What happened?
Well, in one of the biggest things that happens are the Krampuslauf, the parades. Parades. And it happens a lot in Germany. December 5th is the observed date, which happens to be my nephew's birthday. And what happens is there are these massive processions that go through the streets, and they are like scaring the side onlookers, trying to purge them of shadows, swinging chains, smoking out the streets. There's a lot of smoke, almost like the sensing of the streets. Lots of firecrackers go off. And sometimes the Krampus will try to take the children from the parents that are watching. The whole purpose of it serves a very for lack of a better term, I don't like to use the word shamanism because it's particular to Indigenous First Nations peoples. But if you could picture Europe in its pre-Christian, animistic, pagan state, these would be vibes keepers that are like a homeopathy for the season. The darkest shadows are closest as we hit our tide toward the winter solstice, when the night is longest. And it's very much like Samhain in that the spaces between the worlds are growing thinner and thinner for these, what sometimes people call demonic forces, but it's more the wild, primal, dangerous forces of nature that are amoral, have nothing to do with human values. It has more to do with the force of nature expressing its cycle. And
Mm.
so a lot of these vibes keepers, their job, you see this too in the Swiss Alpine regions with the Perchta in January, their job is to beat back the shadows and the disembodied spirits that may have malevolent purposes for people that are vulnerable. So the Krampus kind of served a little bit of a moral compass for people as well. So, behave or else the Krampus is going to get you. But it also served they serve a dispelling purpose, very shamanic in that sense.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. I'm hearing you here talking. I'm seeing the blue and I'm seeing your expressions. I'm like, oh, tell me more. This is so cool. Like I'm here for it. Like, tell me. So,
So that's why people get depressed, by the way. You notice that Christmas, everyone's trying to be all woo,
yeah.
and everyone's like, why do I want to kill myself? Like this weird cognitive dissonance going on because there's this overcompensation with the lights and the presents and the excess and nobody's taking the time to go into the darkness and to annihilate their self, which is really part of the Zen cycle before the phoenix rises again and the winter solstice brings you into the deepest hermitage and then you rise reborn.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So sort of to that point, Rosemary, your introduction, you talked a little bit about how you approach Jungian shadow work. And I was wondering if you could sort of tie that in here with sort of your framework for Jung and how that ties into sort of winter soul searching.
It's actually very, it's almost poetically married as a theme because Jung talks a lot about welcoming our shadow to the table, those sort of excommunicated parts of ourselves that we are afraid of, we fear, we revile, the goat that's sent out into the desert. Nobody wants to acknowledge that. Krampus is actually meeting that shadow face to face in us, in their embodiment. They become our mirror in a lot of ways to look within ourselves at all those intense, visceral, hairy, scary, violent parts of ourselves and accept that there's nothing unnatural about it. It's as much a part of nature within ourselves as the lightning that rips a forest fire into full destruction of life. It's the same sense. So shadow work to me is very alchemical in the sense that you're taking the lead of everything that you are that's reviled and you're transmuting it, you're changing it into gold by bringing it forward, exalting it, allowing it to show the full spectrum of your humanity by, when we share those parts of ourselves that we're afraid to share because it's uncool or we don't want to look weird or we don't want our neighbors to call the cops on us or weird stuff, then that act of courage allows other people to go, I have that same thing going on. And now suddenly the shadow's opening where it isn't you as the only freak in the multiverse. Like we are all freaks with that part of ourselves as much as the moon has a dark side. It's just integrating everything into, I love the yin yang symbol. You know, that very much encapsulates everything from shadow work to the Jungian dance to the dark side of the moon to Krampus. That is actually the shadow of Mikolash or Santa Claus. He's his shadow, and they're together, working as a team.
So speaking of precisely shadow work and finding the freak within and also the talent within, because unfortunately in modern society we believe that the darkness is bad and has to be hidden, etc. But that's where talents are, and that's where survival skills are, because the legends, the mythology of these creatures were precisely to keep people within the home and safety so they're not eaten by winter.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think, or where do you, if you know, that this connection from darkness is safety and gold and alchemy to, oh yeah, darkness bad, stay away, don't even think about it? Where do you think in history got that big disconnect between our raw true selves and this aesthetic vision of love and light?
Well, I think it's very multidimensional. I think it starts definitely with the transition between pagan Europe to Christian Europe. There's that as one part of the cycle of that, insofar as in our earth-based spirituality, there was more of a direct pipeline between yourself and the cosmos. You didn't need an intermediary force like the church imposed, let's say, with a priest, and suddenly a congregation and a sort of more politicized vehicle through which you're allowed to have dialogue with the divine. In those earlier stages, we already knew that we are the sun, moon, and the stars. There's no division. So the dichotomy started with like me versus you, us versus them, God versus earth, the separation of the church and the earth. And then suddenly like everything dark was seen as bad and messy and illogical and Dionysian. And then everything else that was of God became light and clarity and like logic, and if that makes any sense. That is one of a myriad. I don't think it's just that simple to boil it down. I'm sure it happened over thousands and thousands of years, but that switch where the sort of few really started to control the many.
Mm-hmm.
Politics, people being forced into cities, away from the land, away from nature, away from the life they've always known, nomadic life, being quashed, just infinitesimal factors like that in one petri dish of the switch to dichotomy. And then that now starts to create more suspicion with the magic that is such a natural part of darkness. A seed needs darkness to germinate. And nothing's more positively life affirmative than that. So that's one idea that does cross my mind as to the transformation there.
And yeah, I think that's really interesting, because like some of the things you're pointing to there in terms of like the movement into cities and then like the movement of the Christian world, those are things that took place over, like you said, like thousands of years. Like the movement into cities doesn't really even start taking place in a real way until the early 1800s.
Yeah.
Whereas sort of the transition into Christianity is easily 800 or 1,000 years before that in most parts of the world. So I think you're really onto something about this being like a slow transition that's sort of hard to pin down. Like I think that and even all along the way, like in the medieval period, we're fascinated with death. We're fascinated with that dark part of the world. I think that that's always the case. And like I think that that's sort of like maybe one of the things about being a human is like there's some dark shit out there. Let's poke it with a stick.
Well, it's really interesting because if you think about it in terms of like Hindu spirituality and mysticism, we are in the heart of the Kali Yuga. Like the deepest regions of the great dark mother governs where we live. A lot of people speak of the age of Aquarius and don't realize that where the aeon of Pisces moves into the age of Aquarius, it is actually separated by a 300-year void. And that's the void we're in right now. So we're not quite fully out of the Piscean age, but the Aquarian age hasn't quite hit yet. So we still have a lot of themes overlapping in the abyss that are like a murky cauldron of darkness.
I feel like when I'm listening to you talk about this transition and it kind of being a gradual process, it seems to me that it was almost motivated by control. You know, we now, I keep remembering what we talked about in our last episode. We had Angie Buchanan that was talking about death midwifery, about being on the threshold of someone's death and being a part of that process and sharing it with them. Is that when we converted to capitalism and cities and monotheism, where it was like, oh, you can't handle that, so I'll take control of that. So you as a funeral director, I'll be the funeral director and you give your dead bodies to me and you pay me for the service that you can't handle. And I feel like we gradually handed people our power by handing them our cash money.
That's right.
That's
There were whole
about as you were talking.
villages and families wrapping the body, washing the body, whole process. I'm sure. Like I would not even remotely speak as an expert on that profoundly beautiful rite, unless you're a death
Midwife.
doula or midwife. But I'm sure I wish I had seen that interview. It would have been fascinating.
And it seems like with what you were talking about with the Krampus and them reaching out and trying to take the children during the parade, it seems like you had to, in older times, take responsibility for your actions. Is that you had to, yes, Santa Claus was coming and that was worth celebrating, but you also had to face the Krampus. You had to take responsibility. And I feel like, once again, we've kind of handed away our power. Oh, you can't handle that. That's okay. Let's talk that away. And we're going to talk about that.
It's, as you said, Krampus is like a moral compass, in a profound way. In the way that winter is a survival compass. Like you either step up and flow with this force, or it's going to take you out. I love the visceral, primal nature of these sort of pre-Christian animistic traditions of the land, so deeply based in our biology as much as our spirituality, whereas there's a hostility toward biology, the earthiness and the chthonic, as you start to go deeper into the more logical, political religions. And I in no way, shape, or form wish to be bashing any religions. I just want to make sure there's a caveat there. I'm not somebody that wishes to, like, I don't need to put someone down to elevate my point. I feel it's this and that, not this or that. Whereas a lot of organizations and systems today, it is very much about this, not that. That was the difference. You know, the diversity of pagan consciousness did not leave anyone out. It was all that messy diversity of the multiverse. It was fine. You and you. Whereas as we go on and organizations start to rise in power and have ulterior motives, certain things need to be controlled and kept in their place. And one of the first things that had to go was our connection to our own magic and the earth and mystery. And Krampus is all a part of that. It's like, you see, if you go onto YouTube, it is a blast. I really hope you get a chance to look at some of these processions. People are laughing, they're terrified, their children are almost like taken away, and the kids are like, some of them scream and some of them cry and some of them laugh, but it's like they're moving with the danger of nature and the primal. And I love that. Humanity needs that intense connection to their bodies as much as their mind and spirit.
I think that's fascinating. You had me hypnotized by that. I was like, okay, I'm just going to talk now. Hold on. I think that's fascinating. And as you were talking, you know, I'm wondering this whole idea about the Krampus stealing your children. And I understand that some parents, my parents didn't ever do this. They would say things like that. Oh, the Krampus is going to get you, behave. My parents would tell us other things like, oh, the ghost in your closet, he's fine. Don't worry about him. You know, it was just a different thing. But anyway, I wonder how much of that connection, though, is a connection to child death, especially in the wintertime, because as we know, lots of children didn't make it to 8 years old. So I'm wondering if there was either an energy or maybe a personification of that child death. And so instead of like saying, oh, the child died, maybe they were like, oh, the Krampus came or something like that. I'm wondering how much is in there, and also how much is in the psychology of the shadow. Like sometimes I've learned over the years that sometimes it's more complex than just, oh, here's a weird story. I think that sometimes when people have trauma, their brains try to rationalize through other forces why that trauma happened. What are your thoughts on that?
So true. Okay, so that leads perfectly into the Frau Perchta incarnation of the Krampus, who is, and you'll see in some of the Krampus processions, your classic hag with the hunchback and the hook nose and the kerchief and the crooked broom, and she's like, brah. There's I can't remember for the life of me her name. I wish I did. There's a Scandinavian incarnation of winter as an old woman. Frau Holle, Bertha, Perchta, Holda, all these are incarnations of the same. She is like a hag with one bird foot. That's what gives her away. If you look under her skirt, she has a bird foot as well as a human foot. And that's when you know you're in the presence of Frau Perchta. And in some Scandinavian incarnations of a variation of the hag, winter hag, the old crone, every tradition has this incarnation of winter.
There's Baba Yaga and Caliberi. Caliberi is Irish, Baba Yaga is Slavic.
I knew you would totally see all those deep connections in the Fae, the stories of the Fae. And in some of these Scandinavian incarnations, there are these horrific images of, to answer your question about the babies, of this old woman hovering over a dismembered child's body, devouring it. And it really, I think, in some ways personifies winter and the natural forces that we are completely at the mercy of in the deepest parts of winter. If you can imagine people in those villages and in the highest alpine regions, various places where even missionaries didn't get to because they were terrified of the elements, which is why up in the Swiss Alps, some of the most profoundly preserved incarnations of the Perchten, remains close to its origins because they were not subjected to Christian conversion. So still very true to those origins. You get some of these somewhat demonic looking figures with like big piles of sticks for clothing, you know, it's just fascinating. But as for the visceral devouring of nature, imagine these villages without electricity and running water, and if you had a certain amount of harvest throughout the year, by that point, if it wasn't as plentiful as you wished, winter was long and dangerous and terrifying. Cold, dark, the weak and the infirm, in great danger. Anyone very, very young or very, very old. I'm sure it was very, very, very primal.
Right.
Vary a lot, but
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that some of my friends who are or Glawa, right, who are rebuilding Pennsylvania Dutch and Germanic traditions, um, are really trying to like reach back into and research who Hulda and Perkta are outside of some of the like demonization of Christianity, and like, you know, I think all of us here have deities that we work with that have dark aspects, right? And can show up
No,
really scary.
this group, no.
Us, please.
But sort of like move into those really scary spaces. And Ruby, I was really interested because your question about infant mortality, when I think about that and how that shows up in folklore, I always think about changelings. And like, oh hey, your baby's not your baby anymore, and maybe it's going to die. And maybe that's okay because your baby's somewhere else and is safe now.
Yeah. I've speculated many times on my YouTube channel that the stealing of children was a metaphor for death. And another kidnapped victim of fairies was often young mothers.
Interesting.
Would be stolen into fairyland to be wet nurses for the fae. And I also think that because motherhood was it's still a main cause of death in human society. I myself almost perished from giving birth, and that was in 2005 in one of the supposedly most wealthy countries in the world. So I do speculate that the stealing of children was a metaphor for death.
You know, I'm fascinated by this concept that y'all are speaking about, because coming from a tropical country, which is not the tropics, but people say Mexico's tropical. Anything to take it out of North America, by the way. No, Mexico is North America, people. Anyway, we don't have Krampus. We don't have Perkta. We don't have winter monsters that come and eat you, because we don't have a harsh winter. We do, however, have a very famous lady of the night that will come and take you. La Llorona, the weeping lady, right?
Yeah.
La Llorona. And La Llorona is a mother. There's different incarnations of the tale, but it's a mother that was cheated out of a life because she was the mother of the children of a colonizer. And the colonizer ended up marrying a wealthy Spaniard, and she was left behind with the children. And in a bout of crazy rage and pain, she drowns her children, and then she drowns herself. And then she's forever hunted and hunting, looking for her children. So it's a cautionary tale of don't go with the strange guy, don't bury his children, and for children, don't go out at night. So that ties up very nicely with whatever y'all are theorizing right now about the stealing of the soul, the stealing of the children, and then the consequences of now you're going to be a spirit that is never going to rest and is going to be looking for her children all the time. And that's why she's weeping, because she's crying, you know, where are my children? Ay, mis hijos, you know, that's the cry. That being said, I know I took, look, you want to say something, go
No,
for
I
it.
actually just wanted to follow up on that, Laura, because I love the fact that you made that connection. And I do because I was thinking about these parades and about how, Rosemary, you referred to them as Dionysian. And I know that Mexico doesn't have like a winter tradition, but I know, and I know very little about this, Laura. You might know more about it, but I know that Mexico is a big place, and so like maybe not. But I know that when I was at the Mexican Museum of Art here in Chicago last year for their Day of the Dead um, event, they had a section that was all about like monster dances, like parades where people would get dressed up in these big, like demonic looking, like super shaggy outfits. And there would be somebody dressed as a woman who would like dance through the town and like have this sort of parade. And I know that there's also a place in the islands of Greece that does something very similar.
Mhm.
And I think that might be the connection here is like places where we take a moment to like get real embodied, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
like just really like touch base with that sort of animalistic, scary part of the body.
yeah. A lot of that folklore is post-colonial. So it's after the colonization, 1600s and on. And there is a dance with shaggy looking horn spirits, which I think, and I'm not sure here, I'm just theorizing. It came from obviously the colonizers that came from Spain. So it might be a reminiscent influence of that. I haven't really researched that yet, and I think it happens, I think, in the coast of Oaxaca, which is the west coast. Yeah, the west coast. And I don't know much about it, but when I saw it, I'm like, they look like Krampus. I don't know exactly where the connection is, but it's worth investigating. So I have some homework to do. But what I wanted to ask Rosemary before the time comes upon us, um, two things, and I know you please extend yourself into responding as long as you need. Um, how do we go from Krampus to Lucifer? Because some of us are in very good terms with Lucifer. And how we go from Krampus Europe darkness to the fascination on the United States about Krampus, because that is you and I, because you introduced me to Krampus. So I've known of Krampus about 10 years now. But the public in the United States for the last 5 years is like, oh my God, Krampus, because of the movies. So those two questions I needed to get out of my chest in whichever order you want to answer.
Okay. As a deeply devoted spirit of the Luciferian current, I would definitely see the connection with the darkness and the light between the morning and evening stars. If you think of that, morning and evening stars, and follow, because as you know, the morning and evening star is Venus. And you could trace Venus back, believe it or not, with a connection to the Luciferian story. Together also with the whole addition of the Promethean aspect of Lucifer, taking humanity out of its darkness by stealing the fire of the gods and bringing it down to earth to illuminate the darkness of the human condition and to elevate humanity to its higher current of excellence, for which he suffered for eternity greatly. So there's the sort of like integrating the sort of the sacrificial element of marrying the darkness and the light. It's as a perpetual cycle. I definitely feel there's a lot of cycles of phoenix symbolism associated with Lucifer as well. The perpetual descent into the dark, the fall from heaven into the abyss, and then the rise, which I find very much integrated in my personal spirituality. And then as per Krampus, like that's like a little bit of an hors d'oeuvre answer to that. It's an extremely long topic I could go on about, but we only have so many minutes. But as for Krampus, believe it or not, in Canada, in Toronto, where I live, we have had many, many years of annual Krampus parades. And there are organized, like an organized Krampus ball committee. And I've participated in a lot of these parades myself. And a friend of mine is beautiful kindred witch who calls herself Christina Kate White Raven. You may want to look her up on my friends list sometime. She showed up in full Baphomet costume. She created her whole Baphomet on like massive platforms with the head on top of her head and the goat horns and everything, just full on bodysuit so she can paint the breasts and the Solve Coagula, like full on, just went for it. So I think through the media, through movies, through the growing interest perhaps through music or any of a host of collective things like that, there's a slow ascent of the Krampus for sure in the public interest. And I find that very exciting because perhaps it'll give people a healthy channel for their darkest impulses, you know, catharsis of sorts, you know, whipping a chain.
Do you think it's possible that with setting aside the Krampus and trying to force ourselves to only focus on the positive and neglecting Lucifer and the Krampus and all of these darker energies, do you think that's possibly a contributing factor to a growing mental health issue with depression? We're more depressed now than we've ever been. And
absolutely.
Like this resurgence of the appearance of the Krampus is maybe bringing us back to a place where we can let out.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I also think, I think it's probably important to not have a chicken or the egg thing here, but like maybe a correlation, right? Because like, yeah, we are finding ways to like engage with and talk about negative influences a lot right now because society wants us to be happy all the time. That's real. Mm-hmm. That's true. I think also things stink right now for a lot of reasons that are tied to what we were talking about earlier. That move to like, I mean, not to get on my high horse here, but right, but that move away from the countryside and into the city, that's capitalism. Capitalism is also sort of what makes people not be able to like have their own homes, work in tandem with the land, grow family units the way that people used to in like, say 1890, right? And that's like, that's also part of why we are not able to like take the time to have emotional and mental health. So like, I'm super glad that we are engaging with this sort of like darker aspect of ourselves, a lot of us. But also I think that the reason we haven't is also the reason that like we need to. It's not necessarily like this happened so we have to do this. It's this happened and it took this away from us at the same time.
Mm. So I think it's interesting because in my work with a spirit walking, that's my term for shamanism without saying shamanism. Spirit walking and indigenous um, for teachings, it's kind of like um, for a couple things. The first thing is I think a lot of people, the reason why people have the holiday blues is if you read some of the research and you read some of the documented cases, a lot of people talk about this expectation of what success and happiness is supposed to look like. So for example, you're supposed to be white, straight, a man with 3 kids and have all these presents and a Christmas tree and be Christian, and it's supposed to look like this and everyone's happy. And those people who don't have that and don't have families and don't necessarily, especially right now, have a job per se, um, it's kind of like those people who are upset because their friend makes more money than them. It's that, but on a deeper level. Now, putting that aside for a second, or got away, but just aside, if we keep in mind that I personally believe that things happen in synchronicity. So there's a need and a drawing back to that shadow work. I don't have a better name for it. That need to understand and connect with the dark, connect with the shadow. And out of that, in my mind, the Krampus is like being reborn or at least transitioning to a more mainstream thing. So it's kind of like the whole yin and yang thing, but for darkness. Dark and more dark, because of our need, we're almost, to me, I'm a witch. I'm just gonna say it. Is like we're conjuring the Krampus because subconsciously we need him. We need that fright. We need that darkness. I'm doing the hand hair thing for effect. We need that feeling of
Purging.
purging and chaos because, as
Purging.
we know, you can't appreciate the beauty of life without uh, the darkness. So there's my 2 cents on that.
Fear certainly does make you feel more alive than anything else, really.
There's something that we say in traditional craft, and I haven't actually said in a long, 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 long time, that you see the true nature of someone when they're having a fright, and that like boo feeling, like if you can connect with a person who's having a fright, then you'll know their true nature. Isn't that interesting? So that's one of the things that part of our mythology and our ceremony is actually taking the circle to a place of dark, not just, and I do like the dark rituals, not just because it's cool, but because it takes people to a very genuine, authentic place. So when we're in the graveyard, when we're in the forest, and something jumps out of the bushes, we're having a very visceral, real experience versus let me read this line off of a paper.
That actually ties in so poetically with, if you think of the mysteries of Eleusis
Mm-hmm.
in Greece,
Yep.
where the complete annihilation of your individuality was the climax. of the mystery that involved sleeping in a tomb of your own, on various hallucinogenics and moving through great passages of the unknown where things were happening to you that were completely disorienting and terrifying and stripped you down to your most infancy state of vulnerability in order to be reborn, the complete self-obliteration of your isness, of what I am. I really have personally taken that same approach to winter solstice every year. That's how I integrate as one of my many rituals, the perfection of the darkness in modern life, where you can just literally spend the whole night devoid of any electronics, electricity, no lights, no anything, in complete stillness and meditation until the point where the sun actually goes into its rebirth of waxing tide. And I've done this ritual every year for many, many years, where the whole house is in complete darkness and I contemplate the death of all that is, including my own mortality. And when the sun moves into its waxing rebirth, I start from the basement and I light many, many candles that have been spiraling throughout the house as a rebirth of myself, like a phoenix. And that really is like 1,000 times more fulfilling to me than all the pomp and circumstance of commercial Christmas and all of the cognitive dissonance of its celebration in our time. How deeply depressed people feel in that context versus that honoring of the solitude and the death and merging into the shadow self. If you try that, as someone that never has, many of us I'm sure have in our own practices, in our own way, but anyone that hasn't given it a shot, I think that they would have a very different experience of that tide, of that season.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love that as an idea, Rosemary.
Yeah.
I didn't actually know that we knew much about the Eleusinian mysteries. I'm not even sure if that's how you pronounce it, honestly.
We actually know some because if you've read my book, it's in there. In the Louisiana histories, they know certain things because they would paint them on vases. And so it was like a puzzle. They would take the vases and they would create a logical progression on events. So that's how we know.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, I've been looking for years for a good way to, like, celebrate the solstice in a way that, like, is meaningful to my practice, because, like, I think that that's something that we all go through as pagans, right? Is find ways to celebrate the holidays, or whether we want to do holidays or not. And I love this, like, this idea of the ascent. I think it does a lot of the, like, really beautiful parts of solstice and a lot of the really beautiful parts of, like, some of the ceremonies I've been to, all while, like, making it super individualized and specific to you. That's really, really pretty. I like that.
Yeah. So I have done the waiting at dawn for the sun, not in total darkness, I must be honest, but outside in the cold in Chicago. And before that in Mexico City, up on the roof of my building on New Year's. And I've done that since I was a child. On the 31st, when everybody was drunk and passed out at home, I will go on the roof where it was still pre-dawn, light but not quite, and then waited for the sun to rise and get the energy before I even consider myself pagan. But thank you for that gift, Rosemary. And let's move to now. So now, we're here, we're pagans, and whoever is listening that are not pagan, join the train. The Krampus train is fun. When do we celebrate Krampus? How do we celebrate Krampus? How do we celebrate in a mundane way? I know it's really deep, but everybody that is getting to know Krampus. I know it's usually December. Actually, we moved the date of today's subject because I want to make sure it was before Krampus time. So take us there, Rosemary.
Well, one thing is for sure that if you go into the archetype of Krampus in various parts of Europe, they're going to have a different sort of observance, of course, very much like different districts would observe different ways of celebrating Krampus. But the celebration of Krampus is definitely tied into the Feast of St. Nicholas. So if you did, and yes, there's the sort of Christianized iconography going on. But when you dive into, I would actually encourage people to read a little bit about the Feast of St. Nicholas, because then you'll start to see between the lines of the Christian jargon, sort of like somewhat very much more folky, pagan type references to, as I said, the polishing of the shoe and putting it on the windowsill is a very massive part of the night of Krampus. Kind of like the way people wait for Santa Claus on Christmas Eve, which, by the way, I was terrified of Santa Claus.
Too much happiness.
I just, the idea of this jolly man coming down your chimney and ransacking your kitchen just freaked me out. I don't know what it was.
Awesome.
I was just like, oh, this man creeping around your house. But yeah, I would say read on the observances of the Feast of St. Nicholas, and you will see that the Krampus is behind him, is his shadow. December 5th is the big hot spot, though. For Perchta, it's December 5th for Krampus, January 6th for Frau Holle, Perchta, etc. And just when you thought that the winter fun was over, it was the article that I sent to you, Laura, tonight, on the Bujo of Hungary, which are another incarnation of the Krampus toward the end of winter that battle the demons of winter in order to allow spring to return.
Mm.
What's fascinating about them is they look very much like your classic Krampus, and there's a whole craft of artisans dedicated to making the Bujo masks, very much like the Perchta masks and the masks and the Krampus masks. But as I read deeper into the Hungarian tradition, the Bujo's faces are wood stained with actual pig's blood. So that's how you get the red. So they actually incorporate physical animal blood in the mask, which is then used to kind of move through the city and dispel the winter. So kind of like gore versus darkness.
I'm reminded a little bit about the fairy wild hunt.
Yes.
There are many stories of different types of fairies. They're all over the Celtic lands. But one creature that reminds me a great deal of the Krampus, as I hear you talking about them, is what's called the slua. They don't have horns. They're more bird-like in appearance. And they have a hunt where they go across the land towards the end of winter.
Amazing, yes.
And it has that same kind of battle energy to it that you're talking about.
And that is a perfect correlation to the purpose and the function of Krampus in Europe. What you're describing there is perfect. And it ties humanity in intimately with the forces and cycles of nature, of which they are a part. They are that mystery. So that sort of macrocosmic ritual, ceremony, reflects the microcosmic ritual within ourselves. It's very much interconnected.
That's awesome. We're at the close of our show. This has been so much fun and awesome. Any time we get a chance to talk about like scary things, I'm all for it. Was there anything you would like to close with, Rose McCary? Any final words of wisdom?
Um, get to know the Krampus within you. Get to know that Krampus energy. It's very, uh, it's very imperative if you are a magical practitioner of any kind to go deeply into your shadow work with yourself. To state the obvious, any magical worker knows this because it is the thing that'll trip you up when it's most inconvenient if you haven't truly done your work. And not talking about the darkness about the things that are cool. It's the things about ourselves that make us wince and we're freaked out that we're even about. The stuff that's hard to swallow, the difficult things, the melancholy, the embarrassing things, the things that make you feel like an utter outcast. These are all so much a part of the Krampus mythos because it's like it's a tempering of our shadow within ourselves, that moral compass outside of it. Well, I've seen your conduct this year. It's very much like a mirror of self introspection. So study the Krampus. Study the Krampus.
Cool, cool, cool. Well, thank you for being here, Rosemary. Um, we will definitely have you on this show again and talk about more cool shadow things because I'm all about that. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. And if you haven't already, please like our YouTube page. And you can also find us on Spotify, on Amazon, and Apple iTunes. Everyone have a good night, and we will see you soon.